Welcome to a talk about the energy transition, and specifically a skeptical look at the energy transition, showing a somewhat different view from the conventional wisdom. This is based on a couple of reports I've published. You can find them easily on the internet. Most of the material in this can be found in those two reports. Some has been updated, however. So the basic issue, uh, we're being told that the energy transition is certain and inevitable and imminent for two primary reasons. First is climate change. The science is settled enough. I mean, not precisely, but we do know that global warming is occurring because of anthropomorphic emissions. And the argument is that the public is so concerned they support the transition efforts. The technology is the other side of the coin. It has advanced so much for things like solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, that they're going to take over regardless of government policies. And what this means is that you're going to see decarbonization and, generally speaking, electrification. Fossil fuel demand will collapse. The energy industry globally will be restructured and or destroyed. Well, some questions might be asked about that. The most extreme case I've seen is a suggestion from a decade ago, more than a decade ago, that basically most fossil fuels will be abandoned, left behind, stranded, whatever you want to call it. And this one group referred to it as a carbon bubble amounting to $22 trillion. And essentially, they were telling people don't invest in fossil fuel production. Now, some lessons from someone who's been around for a long time. I started working in 1977 as a grad student on energy. History matters, and if you don't know history, you repeat it. Karl Marx said the first time history is tragedy, the second time is farce. Let's hope this time we're not seeing farce. Um, the truth is in the details. And it's a cliche that the devil's in the details. But the fact is, a lot of people toss out cliches like renewables are cheaper than fossil fuel without really being aware of how true that is, or when and where it might be true, or if. Now, you have to admit that misinformation, disinformation has been around a long time. My favorite story is that Ramses II Erectisthes describing his great victory over the Hittites, which apparently did not occur. So you're talking over 2 millennium ago. More recently, the Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, "You are entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts." Uh, I'm trying here to settle on the facts and then draw some opinions from them, but hopefully it's clear what are facts and what are opinions. So the kinds of thing that, classify as mis or disinformation. People say oil and gas are finite. That's not true. They are renewable, but at a very slow rate, so it doesn't really matter. It's essentially irrelevant that they are not finite. People say because depletion prices have to go up over the long term. That is not true. Costs are driven up by depletion, but they're driven down by better technology, better knowledge, and so forth. A lot of people think that oil production follows a bell curve, that it's a geological law. That is not true. It's not a geological law. And in point of fact, oil usually does not follow a bell curve. Um, we find only 1 barrel for every four produced, which means the industry is underinvesting. I've heard that my entire career, and the point is that uh, you find 1 barrel, you discover 1 barrel for every four produced in many years, but you add to existing reserves by revisions, that is more intensive drilling, for example, in an existing field, and that offsets the other 3 barrels. So that's why people say, oh, we're not finding enough oil, and yet somehow oil reserves keep going up. Um, the curse of the Red Queen, because of depletion, you have to invest to offset depletion, and this, some people suggest, means that a peak is near because we can't keep offsetting depletion. We've been doing that the entire history of the oil industry. These days, what you hear are things like, "Oh, we're addicted to oil." That just shows a lack of understanding of what addiction is. You hear renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. Well, in some places, if there's strong wind, for example, and construction costs are low, wind power is very cheap. Solar power in the desert with cheap labor is very cheap. But in places like Northern Europe and New England, for example, you often find that that is not true. And this is why the renewable industry constantly demands subsidies. People talk about convenience as not being important to consumers. That's nonsense. That's basically a way of saying electric vehicles are not convenient, or they're less convenient than gasoline vehicles. You find that consumers don't think that. Most trips are less than 50 miles. Well, that's true, but that's kind of like saying most things you cook in an oven will fit in a toaster oven, so you don't need a big oven. Yet the number of ovens in this country are basically the market share is well over 90%, even though most people also own toaster ovens and microwaves. I love people like Jeremy Rifkin, who is to energy expertise what Kim Kardashian is to, I guess, philosophical uh, philosophy. Um, he says hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. And that's a classic case of something that's true, but it lacks context. The hydrogen is in places like the sun, and the transportation costs are kind of beyond what anybody is willing to pay. Anybody that I know of is willing to pay. Um, I love this. In 1973, during the first oil crisis, there was a meeting, and MIT's Robert Solow said, "Oh, I found a 1931 article that proved that mineral and energy prices have to rise exponentially." Well, the problem was you have a long history of mineral prices and oil prices, and they don't rise exponentially. They don't rise above inflation over the long run generally. And yet, the fact that this was basically violated by the historical record didn't stop him or many others from adopting the so-called hoteling rule that oil prices had to rise at the rate of interest about 3% a year above inflation. You often hear things like the marginal barrel cost is the floor price. So you look at on the right hand side of this and say that's the marginal barrel. It's the most expensive. So the next barrel will be even more expensive. This is a fallacy. It's a misinterpretation of reality. This is not a graph showing cost over time. That is, it doesn't go from time zero to now. It's in fact ordered by the cost of production. That is the cheapest on the left, the most expensive on the right. And what Edelman and Shahi showed 40 years ago is when you look over time, you find the curve tends to shift towards the right. That is, more oil comes from the cheaper and moderate cost areas like the Middle East, not from the most expensive areas. So what you find is that when people say the cost of production, the marginal barrel is $100, as people said 10 years ago, therefore the price can't go below it. They're misunderstanding the basic microeconomics and ignoring the history of the industry. So let's look at a couple of transitions that have occurred in the past um, and that turned out not to go so well. The 1970s, it was all about resource scarcity. Oil and gas are running out. Carter said that. A lot of other people mentioned it. Uh, and a lot of people believe that it was effectively true, even if not literally true. Angst, the Alaska natural gas transportation system, which would have been something like 30 or 40 billion dollars to bring natural gas from Prudhoe Bay down to the U.S. Midwest, said we need this because there's not enough conventional gas, and specifically he said synthetic fuels are vital. We're going to take big plants to turn coal into liquids and to gas. Um, Basically, synthetic fuels, also kerogen, which is shale, not shale oil, but shale the rock, you can convert that to liquids. Um, and his argument was, oh, these things are vital. People are not investing in them because they're looking at the market price. Markets are myopic. They don't look out far enough. They don't realize that we're running out and that the price of oil is going to $200, $300. We had something different in the 1990s. There was people said, new technologies are going to take over. uh, battery electric vehicles, or as they call them in California, zero emission vehicles, are the next big thing. Go watch Who Killed the Electric Car, and you'll see people waxing eloquently about how wonderful that car was, which, despite the fact that the technology was far inferior to electric vehicles today, the advocates said, no, no, none of these problems are serious. We had a bunch of people from James Woolsey, the former CIA director, to Amory Lovins, the head of the Rocky Mountain Institute, tell us cellulosic ethanol is coming. Um, it's right around the corner. We're very close to a breakthrough in the technology, and that's going to push out conventional gasoline for fuels. You also had hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which were promoted by very very assiduously by a number of people in the automobile industry and a few people in the oil industry. I have these quotes are from my skeptical look uh, paper. The Mobile CEO thought, oh, the oil industry is mature. It's a sunset industry. We got to get out of it. The Arco CEO in 1999 said that we've embarked on the beginning of the last days of oil. We had a couple of other senior people saying basically hydrogen, fuel cells, things like that are going to take over from traditional oil. And then, of course, we had the Enron CEO who thought that the integrated companies were behemoths and they were going to go uh, they were like dinosaurs to a contemptuous skilling, as one report put it. This reminds me of Bruce Springsteen, the boss, who said, they're still here, he's all gone. All of those companies are gone now, and the oil industry is still here. So, the cost of bad science. There have been a lot of things over the years that people were convinced were scientific and certain. Overpopulation fears, for example, which are all based on just bad assumptions. Um, these led to coercive child policies in some countries, forced abortions and hysterectomies, for example, sterilization. Resource scarcity meant people spent a lot of money on synthetic fuels, but also Carter said, we really should stick to coal instead of gas, save the gas for the future. The IEA promoted that too. In the US, if you look at the extra coal use that occurred over the following 2 decades, they generated something like 13,000 extra deaths from coal mining and coal pollution. One problem you also had was this notion that markets are not very markets are myopic. They don't see the long-term future. Companies are too short-term focused, and this led to the promotion of things like the Alaska pipeline, which nobody wanted to build, but the government pushed it very assiduously. The Synthetic Fuel Corporation, which promoted a couple dozen projects that were supposed to jumpstart the technology, which people were not willing to do without government support. And people say, well, the worst, it's not so bad because we can always, we're forcing the technology. We need to build it now because we're going to need it in the future. This was a major part of the argument for fast breeder reactors, which in the end turned out to be unnecessary and vastly too expensive. To be honest, I have been wrong myself on a number of occasions about various things. Most famously, in 2004, I said, "Oh, I think Iraq will restore its production quickly. They need the money. They've got the oil." Boy, I was wrong. Uh, Prices came down 10 years later. So, what lessons do we take from all this? First, the consensus can be very wrong. Partly it's because what people think is scientific sometimes is not. The famous case is the Hubbard curve or the Hotelling principle, both of which were put forth by professionals and but were in fact countered real world behavior. Markets often prove to be more prescient than experts, despite the sort of insistence that they are very myopic, even random by some people. Bias is a big problem. Humans are biased. Everyone I know who thinks they're not biased usually then proceeds to pronounce their biases. This is partly a problem because of you have perception bias. That is, you tend to view things favorably according to whether or not you like them to begin with, not the facts, but also cherry picking. And especially you run into people who will, for example, mention some new advance in battery technology, but not mention how many cars are being purchased by people. So it's what's actually happening, not news stories, surveys, and so forth. And there's some particular types of misunderstandings you have. Famously, people confuse policy decisions with physical restraints or constraints. For example, if when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in the early 80s, production dropped off. People thought that was because they didn't have the oil. And then when they reformed their industry, oil production shot up far beyond what anybody thought it would. The other thing, and we see this kind of in climate change science, is looking at something that happened in the short term and assuming that that's the new normal. This was true in the case of energy when you had an oil crisis like the Iranian Revolution, and people said, "Aha, prices will never go back down," and that's just nonsense. You see this in people talking about the stock market. This time is different. It won't go down again. Agricultural prices and so forth. But also, differentiate between challenges and obstacles. There are constant challenges for the industry, and many of them can be overcome. But some people treat them as obstacles. You saw this a lot in the peak oil case, where people would describe some problem and then say, therefore, we're doomed, in effect. Um, but you see this in the transition, and it's on both sides. So you can say, for example, oh, electric cars don't make any noise, so it's dangerous for blind people um, who can't hear it, they can't see it. But you can easily add noise to an electric car. We have had some success. The ozone layer, that was a serious problem. People got together and they agreed to reduce the emissions that caused a breakdown in ozone in the upper level atmosphere. Smog, when I was a boy, I grew up with smog. It was very bad down in Virginia in the 60s and 70s. And it's much, much better now. Most of the country has much lower levels of local air pollution. Acid rain was said to be an existential crisis back in the 80s, and we managed to control emissions of sulfur dioxide, for example, from coal plants. Technologies that was success, I'll give you several examples. Catalytic converters. Yeah, they cost a lot of money, but they reduce smog. That's where that reduction came from. And LEDs have turned out to be, frankly, a phenomenal new technology, much better than incandescent bulbs, and much better than compact fluorescent bulbs, which people thought were which many advocates promoted as the next big thing in lighting back in the 80s and 90s. Low flow toilets, although you hear some people complain about them, they've been designed in such a way that they're just as good as the old ones. So, the lessons when you have clear cut science and the costs are moderate, or you have really better technology, you tend to get success. So, again, why are we getting the energy transition? Because of climate change, yes. Governments taking action. Policies are not driven by science, but by perceptions. Perceptions are driven by science, but other things like ideology, self interest. Lots of people, for example, promote ethanol as a savior of our energy security or the climate crisis, but they're basically because they're ethanol producers or they produce feedstock for ethanols. But we have had technology advances. I'm not going to deny that. Some of which it's not clear how they're going to play out. Will we have small modular reactors on a large scale? Will supercapacitors be the next new battery, displacing lithium ion batteries the way LEDs replace CFL bulbs? Maybe carbon capture, geoengineering will make big contributions. That's not clear yet. So where does this lead us? Well, there's a lot of consensus on the problem, but whenever you have a big problem like this, one, you get a lot of non-expert people. Two, people weigh in based on their ideology, pro or con, left versus right. You see lots of publication, lots of cherry picking of data, though, unfortunately. And because climate change is important, everybody kind of wants to uh, jump on the bandwagon. Nature actually had a study about the Bigfoot and how the habitat modeling might suggest climate change would affect Bigfoot. So where you stand depends on where you sit. You can't fix that. You can try to realize it and take advantage of it. If you're voting for yourself, think twice. If you're a lobbyist for an industry, then you recognize that you may or may not be right, but you're going to be biased, and people will treat it that way. Activists, big problem is they often want total victory as opposed to progress. And we really need to deal with that. People need to pay attention to the cost of programs and regulations. What does this mean? Well, what people are telling us is we need massive spending on renewables, on infrastructure, mostly electric power lines, but also charging stations, electric vehicles. We need to do it fast, maybe some carbon capture, but mostly that people are promoting the new technologies. Generally, people think we're going to have higher energy prices. This is a combination of expecting carbon taxes, which are not widespread as of yet, certainly, but also renewables are more expensive in some places, and they seem to be driving energy prices up. The IA sort of says, well, if technology and policies drive demand down, we'll have lower oil and gas prices. That's not very reliable. If we're going to do this kind of transition, we need a lot of land. Not so much for electric charging stations, but solar power installations and wind power require a lot of land. And all of that means you need a lot of support from the public. They got to pay for a lot, but also they're being asked to change their behavior in a lot of ways. Some of which is, I think, going to be people will be resisting. This just shows you the IEA talking about what kind of consumption you would have according to the scenario. The net zero scenario is the one they say where they're not predicting that, but they're saying what is needed to accomplish that. And you see the big difference is huge move towards electricity, away from liquid fuels, gas, coal. But it's kind of amazing. You still have something like 10% of power in 10% of energy in 2050 coming uh, from coal. The investment needs under these scenarios would be way, way more than what we've been spending. So where we've been spending something like $2 trillion in capital investment a year, the suggestion is that in the net zero emission scenario, you would need to spend about 5 trillion a year. That's a lot more money, and that kind of ramp up is hard to accomplish, and we certainly are not on a trend towards that. Um, this is where the IEA suggests the savings come from: low carbon technologies, low carbon technologies with active involvement of consumers, and behavioral changes are the most minor. But basically, a lot of this is people have to use different technologies to get their energy than they have been in the past. The price impact, yes, okay. So in the steps or stated policies scenario, which is sort of, assume nothing changes, the IA predicts that the price of oil will go up to $100 from 70 where it is now. They've always, historically since the early 80s, they've said yes, the price will always go up. Now the net zero, they say actually it will drop. The price of oil will be $24 by 2050, which is kind of interesting because at the same time they're saying nobody's going to be using oil. Everybody's going to be driving electric cars or using biofuels. So here's the thing. Everybody says we have to act really fast. The UN climate chief said 2 years to save the planet, and he didn't mean everything had to be done in 2 years, but we had to get started. Um, Accelerating this is always a problem. You can't go to somebody who drills wells and said, "We want you to build power lines," or you can certainly add a wind turbine to an offshore oil platform, and probably a lot of the same people, but those cases are few and far between. Costs should rise cyclically. If you accelerate um, the transition, you're buying a lot of materials, especially critical materials, as people call them, rare earths, but even things which are not that rare, yes, I know. But even things like copper and nickel, you need to buy a lot more. People have to build mines and processing facilities for all the raw materials, and then factories to build the panels and electric vehicles and so forth. And you're going to have a lot of boom and bust in there. You're going to see costs soaring cyclically and then declining sometimes. And we've already seen some of that happen. Um, because people want to do it so fast, they kind of want to run roughshod over public concerns. And it is true that the public can delay projects, technologies, investments far beyond anything reasonable. But on the other hand, if you move really rapidly, as Jimmy Carter tried to do, you find you're building white elephants in some cases. Things like the fast breeder reactor or the Alaska gas pipeline, which turned out to be unneeded, but it took years for that to be obvious. So you wind up with a lot of dead ends and a lot of lost money. This is the kind of change in oil and gas demand that the IEA projects under the net zero energy scenario. We've never seen this kind of collapse for mineral usage that I know of, not in modern times. Certainly, probably the closest you could come would be the switch from natural fertilizers to artificial fertilizers uh, once they developed ways to replace the phosphates and nitrogenous fertilizers that you found in guano, especially in the 1800s. This is what it looks like according to the U.S. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory a couple of years said this is what you need to invest, and this is what Biden's Inflation Reduction Act will give us. And you see that we're way below what's needed, and even the Biden fairly aggressive investment scenario for renewables doesn't get us up to the net zero scenario levels of investment, which, if Biden can't do it, you got to wonder who else would. You need a huge increase in efficiency. We've had, generally speaking, sort of 1 to 2% per year improvement over the long run. A lot of that driven by higher prices, no question. But what you see is that the net zero scenario requires a much greater increase in efficiency beyond anything that has been sustainable in the past. And that suggests that, it's a bit unlikely, but especially it's unlikely if you're not doing things like putting in carbon taxes and very large carbon taxes. So the EIA argues that if we're going to achieve net zero, or in one case they call it the ESG scenario, you need a huge increase in battery electric vehicles. This shows you the sales, and then the under the bottom line is the stated policies, sort of business as usual, and then sustainable development scenario, and finally the ESG scenario, which a couple of years ago was before the um, before the net zero emission scenario came out. But the point is that accomplishing net zero or even substantial reductions in emissions from the transport sector are going to require a huge acceleration in battery electric vehicles. In the past, we have seen that these kinds of transitions tend to be very slow. The first diesel locomotives appeared in about 1930, and the reality is that they are far superior to steam locomotives. With steam locomotives, you not only had to stop regularly to get water, You also had to haul a lot more weight in terms of water, but also the fuel, because the fuel boilers were much less efficient than a diesel engine. And you had to do a lot more maintenance. Running steam through an engine was not was dirty and required a lot more maintenance. And yet, you can see that it wasn't until the early 50s that you had more diesel locomotives in the U.S. than you had steam locomotives. And here we just see by type of fuel. Again, diesel locomotives first appeared. The first ones were available about 1930. Most of what you had instead was steam locomotives running on coal and then residual fuel oil. And coal in the railroad sector was still about half the fuel by 1950. So the transition, even when you had companies with deep pockets, low interest rates compared to consumers, and massive advances in the technology, much better technology. It still took decades to accomplish. Mineral needs are also a bit of a concern. This is showing the sustainable development scenario and kind of what they say we're going to need for things from nickel to graphite. And essentially, they're saying you need to really ramp up the production of these minerals, rare earths, but also nickel and copper, which are not, none of them are really rare, but some of them are called rare earths. Um, again, we're not seeing that yet. We're seeing a lot of troubles. We're seeing some increases, but it's also been boom and bust depending on things like demand for batteries stalls compared to what was projected, and all of a sudden you've got a surplus of lithium, and the price collapses, which means new mines are going to be delayed. So let's talk about electric vehicles. Transport is about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Passenger vehicles are about 50% of that in the US. The technology has advanced a lot. The cars are much cheaper, they have much more range. It is true that the fuel for an electric vehicle is typically a lot less than gasoline or certainly diesel. Maintenance is less. People think of them as maintenance free because there's no, fuel blowing up inside an engine, which is very true. But there's a lot of maintenance that still needs to be done on the car: springs, shocks, lubrication. So estimates are that you reduce your maintenance cost by 50-60%, which is not trivial. And emissions are lower. On the other hand, you need a lot more materials. The costs are much higher, and electric vehicles are a lot less convenient than gasoline vehicles. We'll discuss that. So, what matters and what doesn't matter? The problem is that advocates point to all kinds of things that are just completely irrelevant. Consumer interest. Consumers are interested in electric vehicles. Well, I'm interested in Jennifer Lawrence, but I'm not going to have her. Or you have surveys going, 80% of consumers have shown interest in electric vehicles in the U.S., and you have to then say, well, why is the market share in new sales 7 or 8%? And the answer is the survey's not that meaningful. The stock value of Tesla, that tells you what people buying the stock think it might be worth, which is only slightly related to the possible success of the company. It sounds great to say, oh, Tesla's worth more than GM, but that doesn't tell us much about where Tesla's going to be in 10 years from now. If you don't believe that, go back to Ballard Power, which went from a stock price of about $1 to $100 in a couple of years because of their fuel cell technology, and then it collapsed later. Um, Activist preference. Yeah, a lot of activists love electric vehicles. I mean, there are people who drive them and love them, but there are a lot of people promoting them. And their attitude is, we don't care about the cost. We've decided, we have chosen this technology for you to use. So what matters? Consumer preference. Do consumers want the electric cars or not? The actual sales numbers are very telling. The fact that in most markets, you're talking about low double digits, maybe, in terms of market share for new vehicles, and that means you're going to take decades to replace the existing fleet. Um, and it's worth noting that these levels of sales are often occurring while you had major subsidies. In the U.S., you can get $7,500 from the federal government. Uh, States will often offer you $1,000 or $2,000. You can get subsidized charging stations and so forth. So what matters in the end is how many cars are people going to buy when they're not being subsidized. Because if you may believe that the subsidies are a good thing or a bad thing, but as the current situation shows in the U.S., um, subsidies don't last forever. You can't build your business if that requires subsidies in order to be successful. So in the end, it's demand. It's not supply, it's demand. Couple examples. Well, we had the Clinton with the supercar, the automobile initiative, where they tried to bring the car makers together to design a car that would be much more efficient. A couple of them were promoted by cars by companies here, the GM Precept, the Ford Prodigy, and it was kind of interesting. There was a couple of auto riders who said, the Prius is not the car of the future, but Toyota at least is thinking. Well, the Prius turned out to be a fantastic success, both environmentally and economically. And these two cars were never actually manufactured. In fact, what came out of that effort to advance the auto technology was very minor stuff, mainly things like rear-facing cameras, which were pretty much in the works anyway. Um, so we were here before. In the 1990s, California said we're going to require everybody to sell electric cars. And the book, The Car That Could, is fascinating because it describes the engineering challenges and how they overcame them to build the first electric vehicle. It was supposed to be a production line vehicle for General Motors. It became the EV1. And you had a lot of people praise it. But later, it wound up canceled. And in fact, Time magazine said this was one of the first 50 worst 50 vehicles of all time. And as I mentioned, here's the stock price for Ballard Power and how it went up. People thought, oh, we're going to have fuel cell cars on the road within a few years, and they did not arrive. Um, this is a great example of some of the batteries that were considered. Uh, Most of these are technically feasible. They turn out to be much better operating in the laboratory than in the real world. For instance, people found that a battery type that worked in an air conditioning laboratory didn't do so well when they took it for a test drive in the desert. Um, this is a classic lesson for people, an object lesson. There's constant advances in technology in the laboratory. Very few of them make it commercially, either because they're not economically successful or because it turns out that they work okay in the laboratory, they can't be scaled up, or they don't work well in the real world. The only one now, I guess you say nickel cadmium is used in some places, nickel metal hydride. Lithium batteries are the primary one used in electric vehicles. Most of the other batteries have worked in things like calculators and cell phones. Um, here was you see the mandate. That's the left, the line on the left. This is how many cars, electric cars, California mandated to be sold, and then the bottom line is the actual sales. And what you see is, the mandate was very aggressive. And at the time, they said, we're forcing the technology. It can be done. Companies just don't want to do it, and then they abandon it. And the classic case, if you watch the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, Alan Lloyd, the chief regulator, said, "Look, my job is not to promote electric cars; it's to promote cleaner air." Unfortunately, advocates for electric cars start with the advocacy, and then they try to reverse engineering the rationales. 2005, this is a wonderful study, winning the oil end game from the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is much loved by environmentalists and activists. And it basically has all these wonderful quotes from people saying, wow, what a fantastic study. Some of the things they said in the study included, oh, lightweight materials could cut efficiency by 52% by 2025. We're here now. I haven't seen any carbon fiber composites used in cars. I think there are a few parts here and there. Amory Lovins, the principal author, used to brag that Volkswagen bought some, I think, hoods made from carbon fiber or something like that. Um, you also had this study was one of those on the bandwagon of cellulosic ethanol, and they said, we think that we're going to see cellulosic ethanol meet another 25% of oil demand. So basically, they're saying, 75% of oil demand could go away. Now, 20 years later, oil demand is a bit higher than it was then. It certainly didn't go away, and we definitely didn't get cellulosic ethanol yet. I love some of these case studies. The Segway said we're going to revolutionize transportation. They wound up selling the business, and it's closed down now. And they're cute, but they're basically big toys. They didn't change transportation. They didn't move us away from oil. Um, you also had plants built to be cellulosic ethanol. The one on the right is an example. Right now, the amount of cellulosic ethanol made in this country is trivial. It's still 3, 4, 5 times as expensive as conventional ethanol, despite all the politicians and advocates who insisted that a breakthrough was right around the corner. And again, they said that 30 years ago, and we're still waiting. And this is an important lesson. You get people like Al Gore who'll say, well, look, your cell phone is like 1,000 times better than what you could have bought 10 years ago. And that's true, but that doesn't mean the electric car is going to be 1,000 times better in 10 years because the electric car is about chemistry. Batteries are chemistry, they are not electronics. Chemistry does not advance the way electric cars do, the way electronics do. On the left, you can see a floppy disk, 128K memory, and that cost about $3, $4 in the day. By 2011, you bought a little memory stick, cute little monkey, much better than the floppy disk, 4 gigabytes for the same price, $3, $4. Now, I think you're up to 16, 32 gigabytes, and they practically give them away as change instead of pennies. Whereas car batteries, the lithium ion batteries, are a lot better than the old lead acid batteries. On the other hand, nobody uses lithium ion batteries in a conventional car because they're not really suited for that. They're not designed for that type of operation. And if you buy a battery for a conventional car, you're basically getting similar battery to what you would have bought 30 years ago. But yeah, it would be a little more better, a little more efficient, have a longer life, but basically very similar. This shows you that the technology has advanced. Here we have the EV1 from roughly 1995 and a long-range Tesla Model 3. The data here is from 3 or 4 years ago. You can see that Tesla had a lot more horsepower, about twice the horsepower, twice the range, although the range is not that reliable, twice the passengers indoors. The wheelbase was better. Unfortunately, we don't have a price for the EV1. They only lease them. But this is to say, the electric vehicle has improved. It is now a mass market vehicle. However, it's still a niche market. It's a big niche, but it's still a niche market. And this just shows a comparison. Again, this data is a couple of years old, 2022. If you bought a Tesla Model 3 versus a Ford hybrid, you basically had very similar vehicles, but the Ford hybrid had twice the range. It had less horsepower. I'm not sure how many people need 430 horsepower in their cars. Um, it did have mileage, would be theoretically a third of what the Tesla Model 3 was. Um, but you pay almost $20,000 extra for the Tesla Model 3. Whereas a Ford Escape hybrid was about $1,000 more than a conventional Ford Escape. And you were getting about a 40% improvement in efficiency. So essentially, when you think of the Tesla and what goes into the batteries for the Tesla, as well as the rest of the car, you're saying, well, a Tesla built in a place where the electricity system is relatively low carbon will save you 60% of your greenhouse gas emissions in life cycle analysis. But if you're building it in some place like China where they're using a lot of coal for their power, the savings are only like 30%. So basically, if you switch from a conventional car to a hybrid, you pay slightly more, you get a lot more mileage, and you get about the same reduction in greenhouse gases as you do by going electric. And you don't have all the minerals demand. A hybrid car uses about one-sixth the minerals that a battery electric car. Now, I get tired of people saying, oh, Tesla will do to the automobile industry what the Model T did to the horse. No, Tesla is a more expensive, less capable version of a conventional car. The Model T, when it came out at the mass market levels at 1910, it had 20 horsepower. The horse, you'll be shocked to hear, had 1 horsepower. The speed for Model T was 35 to 40 miles an hour. A horse could do 10 to 17 miles per hour, but not for very long periods. A Model T could carry 2 to 3 times as many passengers and 8 to 10 times the cargo as a horse. Now, the exhaust from a Model T, I'm sure there was a lot of VOCs, benzene, carbon dioxide, and so forth. On the other hand, the driver, the owner, didn't have to clean that up. Whereas a horse typically produced 22 pounds of manure a day, you had to feed it, you had to curry it, you had to take care of it. You couldn't leave the horse in the stall for a week and come back later. You had to do a lot of work. Uh, Now, the Model T was about twice the price of a horse, but you can see you're getting a lot more for the money. And what's important is a Model T was much more convenient than a horse. A Model T did not require anywhere near the amount of care and effort to take care of it that a horse did. And this is something now, the amount of charging, how do you refuel a vehicle? People say, oh, well, you can get 80% charge in 20, 30, 40 minutes. I have the numbers vary. There are superchargers available. That's a level 3 DC port. Tesla runs the best. And you run it for an hour and you get about 400 miles of charging. Uh, if you have a port in your home, if you just hook up to uh, your household's current, that's 5 miles for every hour of charging. For PHV, a plug-in hybrid, that's fine. If you're just commuting 20 miles a day, you plug it in at night, you're fine, assuming uh, you're not in the city and having to leave your window open to run a cord out to the street. But I've done this. A neighbor loaned me his car while he was out of town, and it's great. You hardly use any gasoline, and the effort of charging is very trivial. A level 2 port can cost $3,000 to $5,000. You get that for your home. You get 5 times the charging, but you're still talking about 28 miles for every hour of charging. So if you want to dash out, take a long trip, go 100 miles, and your car needs to be charged, you're going to have to wait 4 hours. Um, Gasoline, you get about 3,600 miles in most vehicles, and if you fueled it for an hour, which of course, obviously, nobody does because nobody has that big a gas tank. But you just see the difference between the convenience, or I should say, the inconvenience from electric cars. Um, the cost also varies. Now, this is something people kind of ignore. Um, this is based on some work done by Christopher Nittel, Knittel, at MIT, and some colleagues. And they basically said, well, let's plug in all the numbers. And one of the things is if you look at vehicle miles traveled, VMT, the more miles you travel in an electric car, the better the economics because you're basically spreading the high capital cost, the high purchase cost of the car over more miles. If you don't drive it very much, then the purchase price per mile is a lot higher, and that shows you the bottom line there. And the bottom line there says, if oil is $80 a barrel in order, and you're just going to use your electric car as a commuter car going 6,000 miles a year, then you really want battery costs to be down around $40 per kilowatt hour, which we're nowhere near yet. People think we may be getting there by 2030, but that's also an assumption. range uncertainty. Now, there's no longer, unfortunately, is no longer on the website, but people say, oh, electric vehicles, there's no such thing as range anxiety. The only people who say that are people who are promoting electric vehicles. Um, People who own electric vehicles talk about, well, you have to plan out your route ahead. You run into places where the software doesn't work, or there's a line waiting. I think I have in the last 10 years once had to wait to fill gas in my car because somebody left their car at the tank while they shopped in the convenience store, and it was a little town in New Hampshire with two pumps. With electric cars, people often find they have to wait in line. But the other thing is, you don't know what the range of the car is. So Tesla used to have on their website a thing showing you how much range you would get depending on how fast you drove and what the temperature was. And at 45 miles an hour, a temperature 70, yeah, you got 400 miles of range. But if you drove 60 miles an hour, you lost about a quarter of your range. And if it was, say, 32 degrees outside and you drove 70 miles an hour, you lost half your range. This is still a problem, and you lose minor amounts of range with regular conventional cars in the cold or at high speed, but a fraction of what you see with the electric vehicles. And that is something that advocates just try to shove under the rug. Um, so, it is true that electric cars are getting cheaper. When people say, "Oh, the have dropped 90% in price," you have to say, "Well, electric cars have not gone down in price. To the extent that they have, it's because people are introducing cheaper models compared to the sports car models like the Tesla Model S of 10 years ago. The only car that's been sold for many years, the only one model that has been consistently sold for many years is the Nissan Leaf, and this shows you the prices and how they've gone down. So basically, the price has not gone down in nominal terms. If you adjust for inflation, yes, they have gone down. So it'd be something like 7% a year if you figure on the range being longer and the price coming down. About 7% a year, which is not bad, but compared to people saying, oh, we're getting 20% a year, 15, 20% a year for batteries, you see that it doesn't translate into the vehicle cost. So there's two ways to think about this shift. Demand curve. First, you start with the early adopters. Then you go with people who are brand name fans. They say, "Oh, I love Tesla." Maybe less so now, but they think, "Oh, this is this makes me look cool." You have people who are ecologically minded. They want to drive green cars. I know people like that. Um, and that's as we go down this list, you get bigger and bigger numbers. Then you get to urban vehicles. Now, electric cars are great for driving in the city. They're not as great for owning in the city because, as I mentioned, you can't, charge your car if you live in Manhattan. You can't hang a electric cord out your fifth story window. On the other hand, you are getting a lot more chargers in, shopping centers and parking garages and whatnot, and that's improving it. But because the range is short and you don't use the power when you're stuck in traffic, as you almost always are in New York City. Sorry, New York. Then yeah, they make pretty good cars in for urban cars. Commuter cars is kind of the next thing. Yeah, if you live 12 miles outside the city or you have a 15, 20-mile commute, one-way commute, um, a battery electric vehicle is pretty good for that. I would say also so is a plug-in hybrid, which gives you almost the same electric range as a battery electric vehicle, but at much less cost. Um, but then finally, you want to say, okay, all-purpose cars, the family car, as we call it in the U.S., the car you take on vacation, the car you drive long distances, the car you help your kid move to college in. The commuter cars and the all-purpose vehicles make up the bulk of the automobile market in the U.S. And if you can start to replace all of those, then that's when the electric vehicle becomes uh, the new paradigm. We're not there yet. I would say we're mostly in the third and fourth level. You've got ecologically minded, some commuter cars, but not so much the family car. Another way to look at the supply curve, or the demand curve, I should say, is that purpose driven. That is, what are things being used for? In the first case, supplements. That is, people are buying e-bikes, two-wheelers, three-wheelers to use instead of pedal-driven car vehicles. So when people talk about the huge number of vehicles, electric vehicle sales in places like China and India, they often lump those in, even though they're not really replacing gasoline powered vehicles in many cases. Yes, some motorcycles, but for the most part, a lot of these seem to be added on. Some of them are complements, that is, you think of EV as a second car that is additional to your regular car. And that is certainly useful in the sense of you get a lot of sales. There are a lot of people in America, at least, that have more than one car in a family. And so that is where you get a big part of the demand curve. When you talk about substitutes, though, when you say we replace the gasoline vehicle with an electric vehicle, that is much less rare. Yes, a lot of Teslas have been sold. They still seem to be used more as commuter cars or second cars, not the family car. And you've got the great example of the F-150 Lightning, the Ford pickup, which is all electric and which had record sales last year, almost 30,000 vehicles. Of course, gasoline vehicles was about 650,000 or 20 times as many. We saw the same when Ford offered a gasoline car, I believe was the Focus, and an electric version, and the electric version had only a few percent the share of the conventional vehicle. So uh, we're still seeing a lot of consumer resistance. People say, oh, 80 or 90% of the people who buy electric cars say their next car will be electric. Well, you didn't have many people switching from Model Ts back to the horse, to my knowledge. I know that people, sort of talk about, oh, we're going to put sails on super tankers, but that's not the same as saying people are abandoning the technology. But you do see people saying we simply don't find electric vehicles to be as good as we expected. They're not convenient. The charging is a hassle. The costs are too much. Next, I just want to talk about public support. This is something I wrote an article 25 years ago saying, don't expect the market to be delivered to you if you're making new technologies, new energy technologies that are cleaner but more expensive and less useful. Um, the thing is, we're still at the point where wind, solar, electric vehicles, things like that require a lot of public support. You need it for the expenditures, for instance, building the charging stations, but also, the public voted in officials who gave us mandates and bans. So mandated market shares for EVs in some places, for example, mandated renewable portfolios for utilities and other places. But also, if you're expecting behavioral changes, that's tough to do. The People have spent a lot of time talking about how concerned citizens really care about the climate change and want cleaner vehicles, cleaner energy. You don't see people spending on that. Um, Skepticism is growing around the world. It's sort of crisis fatigue. Every day we're told this is the end, my friend, as James Morrison, the American philosopher, once said. Um, the future is uncertain, the end is always near, was another one of his lines. Um, People have been hearing about, the death of civilization, mass extinctions, from all kinds of sources. Some real. Acid rain was a real thing. We seem to have conquered that. Some was not. Overpopulation turned out to be bad science on the part of people like Paul Ehrlich, who basically doesn't understand demographics. It's kind of the fact that he gets everything exactly wrong and in an opposite direction. It's kind of like if Isaac Newton said apples will fall up. and kept insisting for the rest of his life that he was really correct. It was just, just hasn't happened yet. So you're seeing resistance to demands. The election of Trump is one side of that, where there's a sense of the Biden administration was spending way too much on new energy technologies, the energy transition. But you're seeing that in other countries. The Yellow Jacket protest in France a few years ago reflected unhappiness with higher energy costs, mostly due to taxes, but also uh, we're seeing now people write constantly about how British electricity prices have gone up and up and up, even though they're using more and more renewable energy, which we keep being told is cheaper than conventional energy. Um, Mandates and bans, that's, I think, usually a sign that people don't like your technology and you're going to force it on them. They generally do not work very well. I think partly it's sort of, you keep adding restrictions on people saying, you can't have an air conditioner, or you can't have a gas stove, or you can't have an electric car, you can't have a gasoline car, or locally, one of the towns said if you attach a garage to your house, you have to include a charging station for your cars. Um, and people are being faced with more and more regulations and higher costs. And I think we're starting to see some backlash to that, and the other thing is the land needs. Now, I think it's a little bit like fracking in the sense of, you can go someplace and run into resistance to a wind farm or a solar farm, but there's a lot of other places to go. I don't think that has slowed the investment anywhere near as much as the high costs have. Uh, and there are certainly lots of stories, especially in places like Europe, where there's a lot less land available than the U.S. There's more and more stories about local resistance, um, but I'm not sure we've reached a point where that's going to basically cause investment in renewables to decline. So people tend to be cynical because of the constant warnings. There's a lot of posturing. You get people like um, Leonardo DiCaprio, who did a documentary about, the crisis facing the planet, and we all have to live simply, while he flies around in a private jet and lives in a huge mansion. There's 400,000 people who are members of the Amish faith who live very simply and have very low emissions. Uh, but there's 125 million light trucks and SUVs in this country, and that just kind of shows you, you know, nobody wants to live like the Amish, or very few people do. People much more prefer to consume, shall we say. I think arrogance is a problem too. You don't get people admitting that they've been wrong about things. So some of the things we were told about global warming turned out to be apocalyptic and wrong. I just read Jeremy Rifkin in his book, The Green New Deal, published about 6 years ago, said, oh, if we reach 1.5 degrees C above pre industrial levels, we have a feedback loop and we can't recover. Well, we've already reached that. And you don't see people like him or others, pundits like Amory Lovins or Paul Ehrlich saying, "Oh, I was wrong." Usually, it's, "Well, I was right. It's just the time I got the timing wrong." But again, that's kind of like Isaac Newton saying, "No, no, apples will fall up, just not this year, just not today." You've also had people say you should censor opponents. Um, some of that includes, anyone who gets money from the fossil fuel industry should be ignored because obviously you're automatically tainted. And whereas people think, if I work for a nonprofit like Greenpeace, I'm unbiased. No, everybody's biased. And there are a lot of people who say a lot of bad things, and I wish they didn't, but I don't think censoring them solves the problem. But we're seeing a lot more in the current political climate of people, both ends of the spectrum, saying, "Oh, I'm in favor of free speech, except my opponent's speech is dangerous and should be censored." There's a lot of dishonesty, especially absolutism. Oh, we have to have no fossil fuels. And people say, "Oh, we should have no fossil fuels, no oil." Well, you know what? There's no absolutes anywhere in the world. You want to reduce the amount of emissions, but you don't necessarily need to eliminate them because there's a lot of natural emissions, and you're not going to stop those. You can't stop the emissions from termite mounds uh, or undersea oil and gas fields, which do leak a certain amount of methane into the atmosphere. Um, Renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. I hear that all the time, and yet wherever you look at places with a lot of renewable energy, the prices are not coming down. And in fact, when I've talked to people about solar installation, they go, well, you sign the contract and the price will go up 3% every year. It's like, well, why does it go up? If the costs are fixed and this stuff is cheap, how come it's getting more expensive? And I never get an answer. EV prices, people, talk about EV prices. The problem is, so Elon Musk said, oh, we're going to have a really cheap Model 3, and it came in about, I think, 40% more than he said it was going to be. And people will say, oh, they're really cheap, but then they'll compare them to more expensive cars. EV prices have not come down significantly. I showed the Nissan Leaf example. It's more capable. It's come down slightly relative to inflation. But we're not seeing a collapse in EV prices. And that kind of thing, despite all the advocates insisting that it will happen, that's a result that I think tends to make people be cynical and not trust all the drum banging for a Green New Deal. Priorities. This makes me crazy. Joe Biden's like, we want green energy, but only if it's made by union workers. So, like, union jobs, are so much more important than having climate change solved. That really kind of suggests that you've got a problem with your priorities. Um, that if you want to reduce the level of emissions, if it's really an existential threat, you should focus on that and not try to throw in a laundry list of other causes like environmental justice, domestic content, and so forth. We've already seen many cases where people vote for liberal politicians and support the Green New Deal. But then when you say, okay, we're going to put in wind turbines here, they say, no, no, do it somewhere else. There are no absolutes. This is Ted Sanderson did this cartoon for me, and this is you know delivering the wind turbine made with bicycles. He says, see, now it's completely green, and the woman says, but aren't the bicycles made from aluminum? It would be just really nice to think that there was some magic solution. No energy source is completely clean. No energy source is completely secure. And you have to recognize that and accept it. You want to make progress, not solve the problem absolutely. And bear in mind, the dose makes the poison. I admit I haven't read this book, but I love the title. If you can't live without me, why aren't you dead yet? People talk about all these horrible things. David Letterman said, "Oh, fracking destroyed the Delaware River Valley." Well, there's 1,000 wells a month, something like that, in the Delaware River Valley, and you can drive through there and you will see no impact at all. You also, with pipelines, I love all this. All of this led me to the disaster waiting to happen, Line Five's potential to defile the Mackinac Straits. That was by an opponent of one of the pipelines. The point is, we have 200,000 miles of oil pipelines and 1.5 million miles of gas pipelines in this country. And sort of saying, oh, a 13-mile pipeline, a 50-mile pipeline is going to be destructive. That's ridiculous. Um, and we saw this before with nuclear power. Michael Lovejoy, one of the founders of the Clamshell Alliance, who still even recently was on the radio being praised for the great thing he did stopping a nuclear power plant here. He said nuclear power would destroy the Pioneer Valley. Well, there's over 300 plants operating since 1980. The only major accident was Fukushima, and that occurred because there was 1 in 1,000 year tsunami, earthquake and tsunami, and the earthquake and tsunami was far worse than the nuclear powered accident. Behavioral changes. Are people really gonna do these things? This is what the IA listed as needed to reach net zero in 2050. You need to reduce your space heating by 3 degrees C, that's about 6.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Raise your air conditioning temperature by 3 degrees C. Line dry your laundry. Do it outdoors in the summer. Yeah, that's great. Reduce your laundry temperature. Drive slower. Drive 3 kilometers. That's about 2.5 miles an hour slower. Drive more gently. Carpool. Walking or cycling for all trips under 3 kilometers. Yeah, good luck with that. Uh, 20% globally work from home 3 days a week. Okay, I kind of like that. Um, but you think, okay, we have to get rid of 3/4 of all business flights and 3/4 of all long haul flights. Um, that's aspirational. Are people going to do that? Well, I'll give you an example. One aspect of climate change policy is the argument that many of the things that create emissions are luxuries and not necessary. Just as an example, people say, oh, air conditioning isn't necessary. I mean, it didn't exist until the early 20th century. Why do we need it now? There's a book explaining this logic. And on the right hand side, you can see a graph which is global sales of air conditioning. And you can see they haven't really been affected by the move by some advocates to push for consumers to stop buying. Similarly, we're not seeing a lot of change in, for example, the amount of time people spend outside of major cars. That is to say, how many people drive in carpools. It's about 44% of total trips. 40% is done driving alone. Bikes, walking, all those are very small amounts. So carpooling has cut on to some degree, but generally speaking, what you're seeing is people prefer to drive alone. They like the convenience, the independence of that, despite all of the efforts since 1973 to promote uh, carpooling in this country, but also mass transit, which, as you can see, the number of person miles covered is 1%. Auto speeds. If you drive slower, you reduce your risk of death. For example, if you drive 50 instead of 25, your probability of death goes up 15 times. That's a lot. Of course, it's from very low levels. 25 miles per hour, you're not likely to die unless, I don't know, you drive 25 miles an hour off a cliff. Although then I guess you'd be going faster than 25 before you stopped. Uh, Slower speeds means improved energy efficiency, engine efficiency. You drive at 55 instead of 70, you get about a 10-12% improvement, and also lower emissions. And finally, it's the law. In a lot of places, we had 55-mile-an-hour speed limits, and unfortunately, people generally exceed that. 70% of cars typically go faster than 55 miles per hour, and 54% of cars exceed the 65 mile per hour limit, showing that, people could save money, they could be safer, they could reduce their emissions, and they generally speaking, they just choose not to. Um, One favorite story I had, Maine warms quickly to electric heat pumps. This is a very classic puff piece, I guess you would say, that I've been seeing for many years, where people in the home section will talk about somebody who put in solar panels, and they mention the economics only to the extent of saying, and of course, we need more subsidies for solar panels. This was a case where basically oh, yes, people in Maine are all switching to heat pumps. The story notes that half of the cost was paid by state rebates, and the rest was paid by low interest financing supported by the government and a $2,000 federal tax credit, meaning maybe she paid for a third the cost of the system, um, and that with low interest costs. But if you think about that, for the government to switch everybody over to heat pumps, $8,000 a house, that ignores the subsidies for on interest rates. But for 144 million houses, that works out to $1 trillion. And even if you say, oh, we're going to do it over 10 years, that's $100 billion a year. This is not trivial. Um, Coal, the age of coal ended, I don't know, in 1859 when the first well came in Pennsylvania, Colonel Drake. No, and then Spindletop, 1901, the first big gusher in the U.S. And yet, what you see here is that even though coal is the dirtiest fuel around, short of dry dung, I guess, and other kinds of biomass, but we're still seeing coal flat and in a lot of places still going up. Chinese gasoline consumption. Well, we've heard a lot about how more than half of the electric cars on the roads worldwide are now in China, and they've already exceeded their 2025 target. We're not seeing a big down deflection in gasoline demand, certainly not a peak or drop. It's hard to know the impact of the pandemic and how the post-pandemic Chinese gasoline demand will look. But what we can see right now is despite massive sales of EVs, you're seeing only a marginal impact on gasoline consumption. So what do we need? Well, it's not a question of supply, it's demand. The same people who say, oh, if you don't produce oil, then people won't consume it, will disagree with the idea that, oh, you can solve the war on drugs by cutting the production of cocaine and heroin and other drugs. Uh, the thing is, you need to address demand. You need to have people want to have cleaner energy, want to have new types of energy like electric vehicles. You need mass market purchases, not niche markets. It's great if you have Hollywood movie stars saying electric cars are wonderful, but what you want is the average Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Mr. and Ms. Smith, to say, oh, we're going to drive only an electric car, or we will usually drive an electric car. We need better technology for electric cars and for solar panels. They're still too expensive in most places without subsidies. The subsidies do shift the demand curve, but you have to be very careful. There's a tendency on the part of some governments to think, well, what we'll do is we'll manipulate the price, and consumers won't pay the full price. Or what we'll do is we'll take expensive renewable energy and average it in with cheaper conventional energy, and that will hide the costs of the renewables. You saw this in countries like Germany and Britain, where they paid a lot of money for solar and wind power, up to 24 cents a kilowatt hour versus conventional of 6 to 8 cents. Um, and what happened, of course, was the government started going broke because they were buying so much expensive electricity. They were subsidizing the purchases in some cases, but also in places like Britain and Germany, electricity prices have gone through the roof. Um, Mandates and bans are not really the way to go because basically you're saying this is an inferior technology, you have to have it. And consumers don't always go along with that, and the public doesn't always go along with that. And you're starting to see cases where the public is saying, pushing back, saying, don't ban conventional vehicles, for example, don't mandate solar electricity of a certain percentage in our state or country's electricity portfolio. The thing is, you have to listen to the consumers. There's a lot of arguments about how, oh, consumers are uninformed, or they have ultra high discount rates, or they fall prey to misinformation in advertising. Who killed the electric car? They said, oh, if only they had advertised electric cars with using models in evening gowns, people would have bought them. No, consumers know what's good and what's bad, and they react accordingly. If people are all buying electric vehicles without subsidies, then that suggests they've succeeded. But if you say no, the market share is very small, even with high levels of subsidies, then that tells you that this is not a product ready for prime time, as it were. So a couple alternate scenarios. You could get a faster transition. If the weather gets worse, it gets much hotter the next few years, for example, there'd be more political support for for climate change policies. A Democratic sweep in 2024. Oops. Well, I guess that didn't hold up too well. Um, if that had happened, then you might see an acceleration in the U.S. of climate change policies. But I think now it's a question of how much of the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act will survive the Trump administration. More technological advances would go a long way towards making these alternatives more attractive. Better batteries, especially. Better batteries, meaning electric vehicles could, if they could charge faster, have longer range and more reliable range. But also, better batteries would mean that your solar panels on your roof, you could charge the batteries and have power even when the sun isn't shining, and utilities could also then spend more money on renewables, recognizing that they could meet peak demand with batteries. It's not happening as of yet. Fuel cells, people have been talking, as I mentioned before, about great advances in fuel cell costs and technology. We're not there yet. I don't see them making a major impact on the energy markets anytime soon, but it's possible. Um, Small modular reactors are coming. People are starting to invest in them. They seem to have great promise, and they could deliver possibly a lot of very cheap electricity with minimal emissions. I mean, not zero. The plants require a certain amount of concrete and steel, but it's trivial compared to a coal plant or even wind turbines. Um, and this could mean that electricity would also compete with a lot of other fuels, for example, in home heating, uh, and make electric vehicles a little more attractive, although the electricity price is not the primary driver of EV demand. Fusion, well, we're getting closer to commercial fusion. I'm not sure how close we are. It's possible by the next decade we will see some operating plants. Some companies claim they've solved the problems. We will see if that happens. Again, lots of cheap, very clean electricity, and that could really push the transition quite a way. Certainly would wipe out, I think, coal power in most of the world, and maybe some natural gas power, although it's still useful for peaking. How could you get a slower transition? Well, maybe the weather will get mild again. I mean, there are long cycles in the weather, and the recent heat waves were more than predicted by the computer models. And maybe what we'll find now is that was just a medium term uh, transition, medium term move away from the longer term trends, and we'll see a reversion to the means. And colder weather, basically, people say, oh, okay, global warming isn't that big a deal, which of course is myopic, but that's the way that people react. Greater public resistance. Well, we're kind of seeing that in Donald Trump's victory. There, I think it's not the Biden climate change policies were not the biggest factor in Trump's win. I think the spending plans did help to increase inflation. They didn't cause it all, but they helped. And spending less by the government on alternative energies would reduce the budget deficit and maybe have a deflationary effect. But you're seeing more generally the public saying, we don't want all this land use for renewables. We don't want to pay higher prices. You're seeing that in a lot of places around the world. There are also technological advances that could mean that the energy transition is not as necessary. Carbon capture, I see a lot of stories about great advances in carbon capture, but none of them seems to be ready for mass market adoption. That could change over time, but I don't think it's likely in the near future. Geoengineering, there are a lot of things that could be done that would slow global warming that would be fairly inexpensive. Putting sulfur oxide particles in the upper atmosphere, for instance, uh, putting increasing cloud cover, putting mirrors to block the sunlight from reaching the Earth, putting mirrors in outer space, or just shields. All of those are under consideration, and many more. Many of them seem like they are logical and possibly very cost effective. And in fact, some of them are so cheap, there's a concern that small nations may begin to promote them, such as seeding the clouds with sulfur dioxide particles. And adaptation, we're already adapting. We've had a lot of climate change. We're 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial level, and the world has not ended. It's not an existential threat. We're not seeing mass extinction. Habitat loss is a bigger effect on the extinction of most species that we're seeing. And there are a lot of things that can be done to adapt, and they may prove out to be a lot cheaper. And especially when you consider, for example, hurricanes are not new, right? Floods are not new. So we're going to want to deal with them, even if we do reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. We're still going to want to spend money on adaptation. So going forward, listen to the carpenter, not that one. Measure twice, cut once, and I would say sometimes measure four times, cut once. Don't jump into things. Don't surround yourself by like-minded individuals who all agree that this technology is just absolutely wonderful. This policy is absolutely wonderful. But listen to people who say, I'm not sure that's such a good idea, or the cost effectiveness of that is not attractive. Um, it's very hard for people to be open-minded and still be skeptical, but it's necessary. That's how you should deal with the typical policy challenges. And frankly, too many people bet the farm on policy stability. I've noticed that many renewable energy companies say, well, we need policy stability. And what they really mean is we need guaranteed subsidies. But the point is, policies do change. Taxes change very rarely. Subsidies come and go. Mandates and bans are the least reliable policy support. If your product, your industry, your sector is not going to succeed without policies that are favorable to you in the form of large scale subsidies or mandates and bans, you have got a problem. Finally, this is one of my favorite things. Uh, in 1979, during the Iranian oil crisis, the Carter administration's solution was, well, we need to cut short term consumption. So they sent out people to all commercial buildings and checked for compliance with the emergency building temperature restrictions. And this is one of those certificates that was put up at a building at MIT um, during the Iranian oil crisis. Now, the Iranian oil crisis lasted 9 months, 12 months, 15 months. This stayed up for 20 years in the lobby of Building E38 at MIT, where I had my office for many years. They took it off the wall to paint the lobby. And I'm sure they would have put it back on the wall because, the worker's job isn't to decide if this is meaningless. So, but I swiped it. So it's no longer up in the building. But this is a classic example of a short-term government regulation that somehow never disappeared. Finally, people say, we need, the magic bullet, the silver bullet, the one thing, the secret weapon that will solve the crisis. And I just remind you, there have been several books about the weapons that won the war in World War II, whether it was radar or mass production of ships or the atomic bomb. But in the end, there were millions of people who served and fought and often died, including my father, who is somewhere in this crowd, 1944 at the Arc de Triomphe, where he happened to wander up and get his picture taken just in time. So the thing is, you're not going to have somebody in a lab suddenly go, aha, I combine Coca-Cola, and Mountain Dew, and I've got the solution to the climate change problem. What you need is the public generally changing their behavior, changing the energy consumption patterns, changing what they buy in terms of equipment. And to do that, they need incentives. They need economic incentives and not Hollywood movie stars making documentaries.